If you take a look at the comments section of my rather successful video about Polish fighter pilots in the Second World War, and you'd get the impression Britain stabbed them in the back. Apparently, the consensus is that this small group of the few saved the UK's backside in 1940 pretty much alone. Then, as a big thank you, they saw their country essentially given away in 1945 to the Soviet Union. To add insult to injury, these brave men and women were not invited to the parade celebrating victory that they so obviously helped bring about. And then, to really put salt in the wounds, saw all the gold they had deposited with the Allies in 1939 stolen from them to pay for the supplies they'd needed to courageously win the war. This narrative breeds such resentment towards the British that it's still palatable in hundreds of comments on my channel 80 years later. But how much of this actually happened? Is there any truth in the criticism of Britain and our actions towards Polish aircrew? Or do people just need to spend a few hours doing some historical research? Whenever I hear the same point of view expressed about a historical event on the internet, I get skeptical. This is especially true when all nuance seems to have been left out. As ever, when you look into the background of a situation and really understand the context for the historical actions, a very different conversation can be had. So, did Britain really stab Poland in the back before robbing her and making off with all her gold? I think you can guess the answer. Okay, let's put a little disclaimer here. I'm not having a pop at those brave Polish men and women who fought alongside the British. I've counted several Poles among my very limited group of close friends through the years, and if they represent the nation as a whole, well, what an intelligent and hard-working people they are. However, I have to call Głupia gadania on some of the claims made against Britain and its treatment of the Poles. Will I manage to cover everything in this video? Probably not, but I think it's a good start for your own research journey into the truth. Let's not keep repeating those simple arguments based on random Facebook messages, shall we? The first point I want to make here, and I think is a very important one, is the status of Polish aircrew in the public perception, especially the British collective memory. For anyone knowledgeable in the subject, the Polish pilots of the many fighter squadrons and perhaps less celebrated Polish bomber crews have an exceptional reputation, and rightly so. Although there is a tendency in the online world to overstate their contribute they most certainly did. Nevertheless, by us all over-romanticising how so many Poles came to be fighting over Western skies, it distorts our perception of what happened to them post-war. If I were to describe these Poles who arrived on RAF bases, and indeed French aerodromes, as eager volunteers, you'd probably agree with me. But placing these men in the same column as, say, Americans fighting in the RAF pre-1941 would be incorrect. These men didn't escape Poland on their own initiative in many cases, nor did they defy their government and desert from their air force to join the French or British. It was all arranged, largely in advance of the invasion of Poland in 1939. What I mean to say is that they moved around in large groups, often helped by the officials of the countries they travelled through. The important point here is that these Poles did not join the RAF as individuals, thus essentially becoming British recruits. They fought within the British system as members of a legally independent air force. In fact, the Polish Army, Navy and Air Force in the West were all independent organisations operating under the umbrella of British command. Each service had its own agreement, negotiated and signed, some with stipulations more favourable than others. For the Polish Air Force, things didn't go as well as they did for the Army and Navy. In 1939 and early 1940, the Poles were seen as a bit of a burden, and their reputation among the French and British military authorities was quite bad. This soon changed. For Britain, initially it was a constitutional issue to establish a foreign army on British soil. This also soon changed. A lot of negotiating was carried out between the British and Polish military leaders, usually through the sole officer who spoke English at the time. The Air Ministry made several demands that the Poles found difficult and sometimes outright impossible to agree to. For example, all commissioned Polish officers, regardless of current rank, were to be engaged in the RAF-VR as junior pilot officers. All non-coms would be demoted to the lowest starting rank, despite any experience they may have gained. These foreign nationals would also have to swear allegiance to King George VI. Negotiations continued right through the Phony War, the Battle of France, and into the Battle of Britain. During this time, Poland did offer up some of its pilots to serve in RAF squadrons, where their true abilities were quickly recognised by the British commanders, perhaps giving rise to the misunderstanding they were volunteers. This led to a bit of a discrepancy in the official records, which no doubt has led to this confusion post-war. The Air Ministry tended to view any Polish serviceman as having joined the RAF-VR and signed the agreement set out at the beginning of the war, even if this were not the case. This is why the official RAF history doesn't always clarify that a squadron or wing was actually Polish and not British. However, in June 1940, a different arrangement was reached, essentially giving the Polish Air Force autonomy in everything on a squadron-to-squadron basis, except when it came to operational details. So, in essence, beginning in mid-1940, the RAF and PAF fought side by side, with the British deciding where and when Polish-run squadrons were used. I think this is an important distinction. Polish pilots and other aircrew were not fighting for the British, but rather alongside them as fully fledged allies, just as the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders were. All distinct military organisations under the umbrella of British command as a necessity to make the entire force as effective as possible. So, who was responsible for paying for it all? In the usual narrative, as it's often presented to me in YouTube comments, these brave Poles were fighting as proxy British pilots and as such should have been funded by the British nation. I mean, you wouldn't ask Lacey, Barda, or even Milan to pay for their own kite and juice come Victory Day, would you? But the reality was that post-June 1940, the Polish Air Force was the responsibility of the Polish government, then in exile in London. This included the funding of it, which the Poles themselves readily agreed to. A line of credit for military spending was extended to the Polish government in exile by the British government, the balance of which was to be settled once the war was over. Again, this is an important point, and one that reveals many of the comments on my other rather popular video as ill-informed at best and ignorant at worst. As the war progressed, the Polish contribution to the air war continued to grow. The Polish debt to the British also grew. Then, in the summer of 1944, two important things happened. On the 29th of June 1944, an Anglo-Polish agreement was signed that said the cost of supplies, aircraft, bombs and fuel would be deemed as non-recoverable due to the Lend-Lease Protocol. What this meant in real terms is that approximately 61.5% of the Polish debt to the British people would be wiped off the slate. Then another favourable agreement was reached. In July 1944, a new document was signed. It obviously didn't get a lot of press, as it actually makes the British come off in a rather good light. While the Polish government, then in London, would be expected to uphold their promise to pay back the credit extended to them in 1939 for their armed forces, from the date of the new agreement, Britain would not seek reimbursement for any further debt. Now, this may in truth sound kinder than it actually was. The Polish Air Force, as that is what I'm particularly interested in, had grown to 15 squadrons by July 1944. Despite 35 new air crews being trained per month at this stage, the PAF's further growth was then limited by the availability of ground staff within the free Polish community around the globe. By as early as March 1944, a surplus in Polish air crews had led to a reduction of new recruits being pushed into training. So, in essence, the British may have been willing to forgive any further expenditure merely because the bulk of the spending had already taken place. Nevertheless, it still constituted a blank cheque with no balance to pay. At any rate, by 1945, a figure of £122 million of Polish debt is recorded in the National Archive documents. 75 million of this was deleted following the agreement made on the 29th of June 1944. For the Polish Air Force, it was recorded that the total charges against the Polish military credit in respect of supplies and services rendered by the Air Ministry to the 29th of June 1944 amounted to £42,107,637 and 12 shillings and 1 pence. The Air Ministry spelled out that £5,434,255 plus change remained a charge against the Polish credit, while the balance was now deemed to be non-recoverable under the agreement. So, in reality, Poland only paid 13% of what it had agreed it would be responsible for back in 1939. Don't you wish your bank manager was that generous? It might be apt here to add that Britain made its last payment for Lend-Lease, a sum of about $83 million to the United States and about $23.6 million to Canada on the 29th of December 2006. Of course, much of the original debt was also written off, but the remainder was still paid by British citizens, many of whom were not alive during the war. Blood was not enough. In June 1946, a further document was signed which very much disproves the classic anti-British comment made by many online. Article 5 of which described how the balance of the assets transferred to Britain, and subsequently Canada, would be transferred back to the provisional government in Warsaw. But to be honest, at the moment this is where the trail runs cold in my research. Did this actually happen? I can only assume so. What I do know is that in November 2019, $5 billion, £3.85 billion of gold was returned to Poland from the UK. Among the 100 tons, some 20 tons more than was originally rescued from Poland in 1939, was both historical assets and newly purchased bullion. So we can only conclude that not all assets were returned to Poland following the agreement in 1946, perhaps due to political reasons. So feel free to fill us all in by leaving a comment if you have good sources about this. But of course, the question of the gold is not the only accusation raised against Britain. Often, the British government, by that time led by Clement Attlee, is said to have cruelly ousted Poles who had fought for Britain to return to an unfriendly Poland to face vengeful communists. Again, it's not anywhere near the truth, nor was it a simple situation. If we go back to 1946, we have to imagine a situation where the British government has helped to raise a very large foreign force, much of it on British soil, that is loyal to and commanded by an exiled government they no longer officially recognise. Essentially, as it has been described before, the largest private army then in existence. So you can certainly appreciate that Britain might want to get these armed men out of the country as soon as possible, to avoid hosting one half of the Polish Civil War. Instead, in May 1946, the Polish Resettlement Corps was established to help retrain Polish servicemen unable to return home. This was followed by the Polish Resettlement Act in 1947, which granted employment rights and unemployment privileges to Polish servicemen and their dependents. By the end of the decade, an estimated 249,000 Poles, both men, women and children, had been settled in the United Kingdom. The right to citizenship soon followed. In 1947, the Committee for the Education of Poles was set up with the aim of helping these refugees assimilate into British society. During the 7.5 years the committee existed, it was given £9 million to achieve its goals. While conditions on many of the resettlement camps, often old air bases, were primitive, a war-ravaged Britain did not turn its back on its Polish comrades. It did try to help as best it could. Could it have done better? Possibly. Nevertheless, many Poles did not choose to stay in Britain or the West, unfortunately, often with dire consequences. Of course, the elephant in the room is the Soviet Union. One of the cruelest acts committed by the British government against the Polish veterans was their exclusion from the Victory Parade in London in June 1946. Under pressure from the Soviet Union, the members of the exiled Polish forces were not initially invited. In fact, an invitation to the provisional government in Warsaw was made, but no contingent was sent. Interestingly, Polish servicemen who fought on the Eastern Front did attend a Soviet victory parade later on. Following this, a belated invitation was sent to a small group of Polish pilots, who refused in solidarity with other Polish servicemen. Ultimately, it was all political games, with Britain being very much the junior partner. This entire unpleasant affair is often used to highlight the sudden turn Britain and Poland took in their formerly close relationship. Churchill, who was by 1946 no longer the leader of Britain, is often accused of selling Poland to the Soviets. This has never sat well with me, as it seems too simple a viewpoint. I think the renowned historian Sir Michael Howard sums up the situation best with this quote: "The belief that we surrendered Eastern Europe to the Soviets in Yalta is sheer nonsense. It was not asked to surrender. Soviet armies were already in occupation and regarded these territories as the legitimate spoils of a terrible war. Similarly, any idea that the British and American armies might have pushed the Russians back from already agreed occupation zones is equally fantastic. British and American troops, desperate to go home, would have mutinied if called on to do anything of the kind, and done so with the full support of the electorates that had, rightly or wrongly, learned to regard the Soviet armed forces with admiration and gratitude." In short, had Britain been in the position to give Poland its right to independence, she would have done so. Starting a new war with a nation who had just done the lion's share of fighting the Wehrmacht was not on the cards. An additional thought is, why didn't Britain and France help Poland back in 1939, as they seemingly promised to do? While it was revealed by General Jodl under interrogation post-war that a determined attack by the Western Allies would have been devastating for Germany in 1939, this would have taken a lot of foresight in London and Paris. Intelligence on the true nature of German defences in the West and the Allies' superior local force was not available. The French did launch a limited campaign in the Saarland region between September the 7th and October 16th, 1939, but it was not pushed home. French strategic doctrine and mobilisation capabilities did not lend themselves to such an attack in 1939. Although disastrous for Poland, perhaps it was well for the world as a whole. It's unlikely that a successful invasion of Germany in 1939-1940 would have led to the complete destruction of the Nazi state. A negotiated peace might have led to an intact totalitarian state remaining within German borders for decades to come. So, in conclusion, it's not fair to say that Britain unfairly demanded gold from Poland when she herself had signed up to the agreement. Furthermore, the debt that was incurred was significantly reduced by subsequent agreements. Ultimately, Poland paid its share for victory both in blood and treasure, just like everyone else, even if politics denied that nation the expected freedom it deserved post-war. If you've enjoyed this video, then please give it a like to help it spread to more people, and do consider subscribing to the channel, and that will encourage me to make even more videos like this. Let me know in the comments if you think I've missed anything, or if you've got anything to add to the conversation, and I will do my best to reply as soon as I can. Thanks again for watching, guys, and hopefully see you again soon.